This is lecture 3.2, ethics. In our previous lecture, we talked about research methods, and now we are talking about how we need to be ethical with those methods. We will talk about why we need to do that. We will talk about who cares if we are ethical or not. And we will talk about some notoriously bad examples of people who were not necessarily ethical in their research. So why? Well, social scientists study humans. This creates certain ethical issues, right? And in our society, we acknowledge that humans have certain rights. Humans shouldn't be tortured. Humans shouldn't be held against their will unless they've done something wrong. We generally agree on that as a society. Humans shouldn't be starved. Humans have a certain right to autonomy over their bodies and to say what happens to their bodies. We grant those things to humans. Should we extend those rights to animals? Well, there is a certain debate over that in our society, but with humans, we absolutely agree on those things. Additionally, humans have emotions. Humans have senses of themselves. Humans have all of these complex feelings that, say, a bowling ball or chemicals or other things that are studied in science don't have those issues, but humans certainly do. And if you're going to get super practical about it, humans are protected by the law. So even if we were thoroughly unethical individuals, it's against the law to hurt people. So if that's the only thing keeping you from hurting people, well, just know that it's against the law, and please don't hurt people. But who cares? Well, the American Sociological Association cares. It is the professional association of sociologists. And the ASA has developed its own code of ethics to help researchers avoid bias and adhere to professional standards and protect respondents from harm. So there is a detailed code of ethics that all sociologists are familiar with that determines what we can and can't do. And for the purposes of this class, I don't need you to know what the specific details of that code of ethics are, but you need to know that it exists. And there are certain standards that exist regarding how you can and can't do sociology. An institutional review board is someone else who cares on how you do your social scientific research. A review board is a group of scholars within a university or college that meet regularly to review and approve the research proposals of their colleagues to make recommendations on how to protect human subjects. Why do we need this? Well, we need to protect human subjects, obviously. We need to keep bad things from happening. We need to prevent the waste of money, right? So maybe a project has already been done, or maybe a project has no merit. That's why we want to do that. And also, we want to protect the university. Often, an IRB is, universities are very concerned with lawyers, right, and being sued. And, an IRB is also concerned with that. If we are generous, we will say that's because the university doesn't want to break the law. If we're less generous, we can say, well, that's because the university doesn't want to hurt its public image. Either way, IRBs exist. Now, here are some bad examples of social scientific research. And you will note that this is going to be a relatively quick lecture, and you're probably happy about that considering the previous lecture was rather long. So here's our first big don't do this of social science, the Milgram experiment, conducted in 1967. If you've taken a psychology course, you may be familiar with the Milgram experiment. Sorry about that. Apparently I have Facebook notifications. Milgram wanted to understand why people in Nazi Germany listened to orders despite being ethical beings, right? Certainly, there were people, Nazi Germany, there were rational, good people that lived in Germany during that time, right? They weren't inherently bad people. There were a lot of good people there. But the bad people were in charge. One second, let me look at the next one. Yes. And Milgram wanted to understand why. Well, Milgram couldn't go back to Nazi Germany in the year 1967, right? It was all over and done with. But he could recreate similar results on why people, good people, seemingly good people, would do horrendous things. So in his experiment, Milgram identified one person to be a teacher and one person to be a learner. The teacher was instructed by a man in a lab coat to administer shocks to the learner who had to answer a series of questions. The learner, however, was actually an actor. He was not being shocked. There was a ruse, right? It was a trick. The teacher was the one actually being studied. And Milgram wanted to understand how or if the teacher could be driven to administer shocks that could potentially kill a person. So no one was actually being shocked. No one was actually being physically hurt. But the teacher was led to believe that he is causing a great deal of pain and possible death to the learner. He heard recorded screams and pleas to the learner that the learner's heart was hurting, right? That he might have a heart attack. And this caused psychological trauma to the teachers, right? And that was the unethical component, right? That's where the unethical part started, right? It wasn't physical, it was emotional. The subjects, however, were fully debriefed, which is a premise of especially psychological studies, but all social scientific studies, that you have to debrief your people. But the emotion being felt during that experiment was very real. Modern psychology will tell us that that kind of thing can cause a post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in people, being put through a highly emotional situation, even if that situation isn't real, right? If your mother is perfectly healthy, but someone tells you that your mother actually just died, and then you find out later that your mother's still fine, that situation can still cause you a tremendous amount of psychological harm. So that's the one unethical component of it. Another unethical component of it is that it unwillingly showed respondents what that they were fully capable of, right? It changed that individual's self-narrative. We like to think that we would have been one of the good people in Nazi Germany that would have hidden Anne Frank, right? That would have helped the Jews. But if we are put in a situation against our will to tell us that, actually, no, you would have been one of the bad ones, that is highly unethical to do. You cannot change somebody's self-concept without them being willing to explore it themselves. So that's one example. Another example was the Stanford Prison Experiment. This was a work of social psychology, so still psychology, but a slightly different version of psychology. They wanted to know, why can prison guards be so horrible to prisoners? There were some studies and observations that, some really terrible things can happen in prisons. And why does this happen? And actually, and this is interesting, Zimbardo was his name, the man that was in charge of the Stanford Prison Experiment. He sought to study the same thing that Milgram studied. But actually, Zimbardo wanted to do it in an ethical way. Zimbardo, and this is really very interesting, Zimbardo wanted to fix Milgram's study, right, and not traumatize people. Zimbardo thought that the most unethical thing about Milgram's study was that there was a person in a lab coat encouraging somebody to shock someone. And that was what caused the trauma, right? Is driving someone to do things that they wouldn't normally do. However, it's the Milgram, the Stanford Prison Experiment failed miserably in not being unethical. So it was a method of an experiment. 20 college men were divided into 2 random groups. In those 2 random groups, there were 10 prisoners and 10 guards. Going into the study, the young men did not know whether they would be prisoners or guards. A coin was flipped. They say, you're a prisoner, you're a guard. You could have been in either group. This was done in the basement of a psychology building that was set up to look like a mock prison. It would be just like, it would be a similar building to many of which that you would take in-person classes at UNM or somewhere else. Students played the roles of guards and prisoners, and they were set to do that for 2 weeks, to do what a guard would do or do what a prisoner would do. There would not be a researcher telling them to do these things, but there would be no one also not telling them what not to do. They would be performing their roles by virtue of the social structures presented to them. Why was this unethical? Well, there were consequences that were unforeseen but catastrophic. So to do ethical research, there is a certain degree of when to pull the plug, right? If things are going terribly wrong, you also need to have ethics to know when they're going terribly wrong. Guard behavior quickly became cruel. So those prison guards quickly came to be, they did some really nasty, vile stuff. They enforced solitary confinement. So there were students locking students who were prison guards, locking other students who were, quote, prisoners that did nothing wrong in closets for hours and days at a time. There was a dehumanization and vilification of prisoners. Guards actually started thinking of the prisoners, who were just students, just like them, as actually being dangerous. This treatment of the guards on the prisoners caused nervous breakdowns and panic attacks among the prisoners. There is video footage of this. It is relatively disturbing. And the experiment ended early after only 6 days. The 2 weeks didn't even hit its 7-day point, right? It didn't even hit the halfway mark. They had to pull the plug on the whole thing because goodness knows what would have actually happened if it would have gone for a whole 2 weeks. And the tea room trade study. This is sociology's bad example of don't do this thing. We are not without blame in our discipline. The tea room trade study was conducted in 1970. The question was, what are the characteristics of homosexual men? Keeping in mind that in this era, it was not socially acceptable to be openly and outwardly gay. And also, we didn't know so much about what it meant to be gay too, both as a society and as social scientists. So to ask this question is interesting, but the way Laud Humphreys, which is the name of the man that conducted the study, did it was unethical. So his method was field observation, which is something that we do a lot of in sociology. The researcher volunteered to be a lookout at so-called tea rooms. Tea rooms are restrooms, or were during this era, restrooms at public parks that men would meet for anonymous sex. Studying that thing in and of itself in sociology is not unethical. There are sociologists that study bordellos. There are sociologists that study drug houses. There are sociologies just any number of illegal and deviant behavior. Studying the thing is not unethical. How he did it was unethical. While men were having sex, Humphreys would note the license plates of the subjects. He then tracked the plates using the DMV and went to the men's houses as a census taker. That violation of privacy, that is the unethical component. Specifically, when studying sexual minority groups or any minority group, the number one rule is you may never out someone. That's up to the individual. That's something an individual does. It is not something you do, right? Additionally, he found that most subjects were married to women. And that is an amazing scientific finding, right? That is not something most people would suspect, especially in the 1970s, right? That's a big deal. That's a revolutionary finding. But in talking to those women, he could have easily outed them, right? He could have ruined lives that people, he could have ruined relatively happy marriages, right? Or even very happy marriages. It was not his place to put those men's lives, their social lives in danger. Could have been their living lives in danger, right? Because this is an era where it was okay to, physically punish someone for being gay. So I already addressed this. It was a major violation of privacy. It could have easily outed the subjects. It could have destroyed marriages and caused physical harm. But the Tea Room Trade Study actually was awarded the C. Wright Mills Award for excellent work in sociology, right? That was not without controversy. People were really, it was a majorly controversial within the field of sociology, but it did find really very fascinating things. Unethical studies are not without, there's a reason why we do them, right? We don't seek out to do them, but they happen sometimes because by pushing the envelope, we sometimes venture into unethical areas. And that's why we have to be ever vigilant to stay ethical within the discipline of sociology. Okay, that is good for now. Luckily, we were a little shorter this time. If you have any questions, please let me know. As always, send me an email, and I look forward to our conversations.